So the secretaries at work do this awesome thing. Every Thursday, they bring in little donut holes for the whole office to share, and they call it Holy Thursday. And then on actual Holy Thursday, they didn't bring donut holes. All right, later this year, all of the bishops in the entire world are gonna go to Rome for a gigantic meeting. And gigantic meetings of all the bishops is called a synod. S-Y-N-O-D, synod. This year, they had to pick a topic, and they picked young people, the faith, and vocational discernment. Because some places, like America, no young people go to church anymore. But the thing is that none of the bishops count as young people, so they need the opinions of young people to help them figure out what to do at the meeting. So they had a pre-meeting, a pre-synod meeting, and it had 300 people at it, ages between 16 and 29, picked by their local bishops, or picked by other movements, organizations across the world that are Catholic. The United States bishops picked 3 people from our country, and there were 2 more Americans that were picked because they were collaborators with other movements and organizations. 5 Americans at this meeting of over 300 people, including official Steve the Missionary person I have met, Katie Prejean McGrady, who's awesome and has written a couple articles about her experiences at this meeting. And they, like anyone else that does a Vatican meeting, came up with a document. Pre-synodal document for young people, the faith, and vocational discernment. There is a link in the description for anyone who wants to read it. It is some real church nerd insider baseball shit. And I have already read it. I read it for work, actually. I wanted to tell you my thoughts on it and give you a little bit of a rundown on what it is and what it's about, especially some repeated themes. Okay, so the first thing that I have to tell you is that I really, really, really liked it. This document is not a teaching document. It's not like a catechetical piece of work. It is young people talking to bishops, telling them who we are, what we care about, and what we need from the church. They met for over a week to come up with this document where everybody from around the world talked about who they are, what they care about, and what they need from the church. And then they had to write it down in a document. They took all that time in meeting and condensed it into 14 pages. So 14 pages means that every sentence is important. Nothing is wasted. If something is mentioned only once, then it was important to be mentioned at least once and to take up that much important real estate in this document. And if it got mentioned twice, whoo, please pay attention. So we're gonna talk about things that were mentioned more than once. The first thing that I noticed over and over and over again, women are mentioned. At the end of almost every section. The need for women to have leadership in the church and to have a deeper understanding of the role of women in the church. Mentioned constantly. And they didn't bring out specific. It was kind of funny. It was almost as if we didn't know what the starting point theologically was to talk about women in leadership in various capacities in the church. We need to talk about this. The one that kind of surprised me in how much it was mentioned was actually belonging. The sense that young people do not feel like they belong to the church. Young people often don't feel like they belong to any culture or their community. A lot of times young people don't even feel like they belong to each other. There's a huge problem of belonging in young people that needs to be addressed by somebody. And the church is probably one of the better groups to do it. Over and over again, usually in really, really short sentences, fear is mentioned. Young people fear the future. This is not a good thing. Young people fear the instability in various countries and various economies. Young people fear the instability going on in families and in marriages. We have a lot of fear, and a lot of times that is in direct conflict with what we thought was our potential, and what we thought were our dreams. An extremely important thing that got mentioned more than once was the need for mentors. Not ministers, mentors. This is such an important thing. I'm gonna make a whole nother video about it next week. There was no request for more ministers. There was only request constantly for more mentors. It was always coupled with the need for authentic witness, making sure that our church is filled with people who give authentic and beautiful witness to the faith, and usually filled with joy as a consequence of having the faith. Maybe this shouldn't be the priests and the bishops. This should be random people in the church. Random authentic Christian witness, I think, is really what we're... Lastly, something that got mentioned more than once is a need for integrity within the church. That's pretty obvious. The church should do less bad things and apologize when they do. Real basic. If you're reading the document, you can actually compile together a list of the social issues that young people believe the church should engage in, work with, and usually work to help. So here's the list. Sexuality. That really broad, but okay. The church should fix sexuality. addiction, failed marriages, broken families, organized crime, forced migration, narco trafficking, violence, corruption, exploitation, femicide, war, climate change, all kinds of inequalities, all kinds of environmental degradation, basically any form of persecution. They also made this really interesting list of controversial issues that as a group they say the church needs to engage in, but also as a group they could not agree on how. And this ends up being basically the stuff you hear about in the news about the Catholic Church. So contraception, marriage, homosexuality, gender issues, and the role and function of a priest. So my first question to everyone watching, and please answer in the comments, is that list, does that represent you? Is there something that was missing? Is there something that the church needs to start engaging that it hasn't heard about yet? I also want to point out a couple things. There were 2 mentions at least of silence in prayer and silence in group prayer like liturgy, and a specific reference to traditional forms of the liturgy. A lot of people who like traditional forms of liturgy did not think that was enough and would cite it against all the other things that I was mentioning, especially the first 2 that were mentioned a lot. They spent a lot of time talking. But again, this document changed topics almost every sentence. If you got mentioned once and you got mentioned, your voice was heard, it will be specifically stated to the bishops. So don't act like you got shortchanged. If you were all over like a Facebook group talking about traditional liturgy, like you only ended up in like 2 or 3 sentences ended up in 2 or 3 sentences in the document. There's also an idea that being extremely online is different than being a majority voice. But there's also kind of a disagreement of opinion. There are people that like traditional liturgy and think that it can solve a lot of problems. I've seen churches kind of get revitalized by a more traditional form of their liturgy, and it's beautiful. Liturgy and good liturgy can and does accomplish a lot of things. But there's a group of people that think that fixing the liturgy will literally solve all the church's problems, and that is the thing young people want, and fixing that will fix all the other things that we mentioned earlier in the video. I disagree, and I think the people in the meeting disagreed, and I think they're right to disagree. And that opinion is, I feel, a little dumb and shouldn't be in a document that we hand to the bishops. A little short-sighted. But also remember the scope of the document. From young people to the bishops before their synod on young people, the faith, and vocational discernment. So like, I think that the document should have had a lot more about evangelization, but guess what? This synod isn't about evangelization or even young people's opinion on evangelization. It's about who young people are, what the faith is, and vocational discernment. Maybe liturgy just doesn't fit in the scope of the synod because evangelization doesn't fit in the scope of the synod. If you want to be a hardcore church nerd, go in the doobly-doo and read the whole document. It is wonderful. There are plenty of reactions and hot takes about it already up. The synod is later this year. The Pope will write a document about it probably early next year. All of that is going to happen on this channel because this is something I care deeply about. It's literally my day job. So stick around. I'll see you next week.